Okay, so what is evolution? So evolution basically is that organisms have descended from other organisms, and we notice a change over time in that descent. So sometimes we call it descent with modification. So you'll hear it sometimes real basically as change over time, but it's so there's the change. And the time is that organisms have descended from previous organisms or ancient organisms. All right, so that's the what evolution is. So I want to talk a little bit about the pattern versus the process of evolution. The pattern of evolution is the data that we see. So, excuse me, the big thing here is the fossil record. We can see in the fossil record the pattern of evolution. We see that there are organisms that are no longer here. We see that there are organisms that have changed over time. They look different than their ancestors did. That's the pattern of evolution. And, since we're going to be talking about Charles Darwin, even in Charles Darwin's day in the 1800s, scientists at that time knew that things evolved. That was not a question. We could see that in the data. The process of evolution, though, during Darwin's time was a little bit of a question mark. How did organisms change? So this is where Charles Darwin comes into play. So let me give you just a quick history of Charles Darwin. He basically was a naturalist, which is a biologist, and he got invited to go on a trip around the world to collect organisms and to see the world, basically. So he went on this trip just to do that, and he wrote a book called Voyage of the Beagle. It was on the HMS Beagle, and they spent about, I think it was 6 years on the boat, traveling around the world. And he just went to do that. And what he saw on the way was that there was a lot of things that he saw that he questioned. Why are only certain organisms in certain areas of the country? How does the environment play into the organisms that are there? How do organisms become adapted to certain environments? So he started asking those questions as he was traveling, and he then basically did not set out to do this, but came up with the process of evolution. He came up with the how. How do organisms change over time? And he came up with what we call natural selection. All right, and after his Voyage of the Beagle. And so he wrote a second book called On the Origin of Species, which was a huge book. And this is what I guess got him into trouble. He actually wrote the book, was not going to publish it till he died, told his wife, don't publish it till I die, ending up publishing it for a variety of reasons. Several of his friends, Charles Wallace, you're going to see here Lamarck, they were trying to come up with the process of evolution. They came up with basically the same thing he did. So he decided to publish before he died just to sort of get the credit. So you'll see he had the backing of some of his friends to do that. But this is the one where, this is where Charles Darwin comes to the forefront, is because of this book on the origin of species. All right, so what is that process of evolution? The how, the natural selection. So what is natural selection? So it's a big, long definition. So it's the process where individuals that inherit certain traits survive better than others and pass those traits on. Okay. So they survive better at higher rates, and they then pass those traits that they have that makes them better at surviving onto their offspring. And this is natural selection. This is the process of how things change over time. Those that have certain traits, adaptations, allow them to survive better, and they pass on those traits over time. So what should happen here is that between organisms and their environment over time is they become better and better matched. So they're better and better able to survive in that environment because those traits that allow them to survive in that environment get passed on. Okay, and they survive better. So new species then arise. So this, I guess, one of the issues that we see with this is that I get that beaks could change from bigger to smaller because of small variations and they get passed on. But it doesn't show me that I get a new species. All right, so how do new species arise? By the process of natural selection. So we're going to see that, and it has to do with reproductive isolation. And we're going to talk a lot more about this on later topics. All right, but you're going to see here that if species become different enough that they can't reproduce together, then we get a new species arising. All right, so natural selection can lead to new species. It doesn't always. It can, just lead to differences in organisms. Beak size is different. Height is different over time. All right, excuse me. All right, so first of all, just some things here. Do individuals in a population evolve? No. Only the species can evolve. So I can't say that one individual is evolving. It has to be the species as a whole. Are beak sizes changing over time? Not just one beak size in one individual, but as a whole. Are their beak sizes changing? Variation is super important to evolution because if organisms are not different from one another, then no one has a trait that allows it to survive better. If they're all the same, they all survive the same. But if there are slight differences, one has a little bit bigger beak than the other, one has a little bit different coloration than the other, then those organisms may be better able to survive. So without variation, no variation, no evolution, basically. No natural selection, okay? Because natural selection says some have traits that allow them to survive, and if those traits are all the same, then that doesn't work. So there has to be some variation in order for natural selection and evolution to work. All right, and we know that that variation we can see in a phenotype. All right, so a phenotype is what an organism looks like because of their genotype, because of the genes that they have. What do they look like? So you'll see that natural selection always works on a phenotype, right? What it looks like. So what determines whether traits are passed on or favored? Well, it all depends on the environment that they live in. So a white coat in the Arctic is a favorable variation, but a white coat in the woods is not, because you can see that. So just depends on your environment and where you live and where you mate to determine whether or not those traits are going to be passed on and whether they're favorable in that environment. Okay, so if your environment changes, all of a sudden a trait that you have could make you not able to survive in that environment. So the environment is huge when it comes to whether traits are an advantage or not. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about Lamarck because this is an activity that you're going to have to do. So Lamarck was one of the first scientists that tried to come up with that pattern of evolution. And I'll just say here, he did use versus disuse. So what he said was that if I use my hand and it gets bigger, he did it with crab claws. You know how crabs, their first claws are real big? He said, well, they obviously use those claws a lot and they get bigger and then they get passed on. All right. So he said, if I use it, it gets bigger, it gets passed on. If I don't use it, it gets smaller and maybe doesn't get passed on. So he said it was use and disuse that caused something to get passed on. So Darwin looked at that and said, well, that's possible. But actually, Darwin understood that, if I work out and I get big muscles, it doesn't mean I'm going to pass that on to my kids. It has to be something that you inherit. It's a trait that you already have that gets passed on to your offspring. So this is big because I'm going to show you here. So why is this inaccurate? So we're, talking about viruses now anyway with the whole coronavirus. So antibiotics have created drug resistance in bacteria, all right? So in MRSA and things like that. So a lot of people will say that the bacteria get used to being around the antibiotics and therefore That's why we're becoming more and more resistant. That is a Lamarck way of saying things. Bacteria just can't become used to something and then pass that on. That'd be like me saying that, all right, well, if I go out in the cold every day, I get used to the cold, and then my kids are going to be more used to the cold. That's not how it works. It has to be a trait that I inherit that I can pass on to my kids. The only thing I can pass on to my kids is something that's in my genes. If I dye my hair blonde, I can't pass that on to my kids. If I get used to the cold, I can't pass that on to my kids. So bacteria just can't become used to something and then become resistant. It has to be, Darwin would say that some bacteria have mutations or something that allows them to survive in the presence of those antibiotics. So those are going to be the ones that survive that natural selection process to reproduce. And those then are going to reproduce that same gene, and that's going to get passed on. So over time, bacteria become more drug resistant because some of them had a trait that allowed them to survive, and they passed that on. Not that they got used to it and then passed it on. That's a huge difference. So there is a worksheet that you're going to do that has statements, and you're going to say whether that is a Lamarck statement or a Darwin statement, and we'll work on that, and that's what you have due today.